Hello and Happy New Year to you and yours. Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Happy New Year, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you were up this week, the first week of 2025.
Yes.
What do you bring to the table today?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be bringing our first piece of media to the table for 2025. We're in 2025. It's wild. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to bring, I, was researching on the web and I happened to remember that I got an email from our friends at Hammer and Hope where they announced, this was in like late December, they announced that they had released an expansion to their latest issue with 4 new articles to help folks process the 2024 election and figure out a plan for what to do moving forward. And when I remembered that email and found it, I was like, okay, this is a sign that I was meant to bring one of these pieces to the table. So the piece I chose, they're all great. I would encourage folks to read them all. But the piece I brought from Hammer and Hope is called Donald Trump's Victory, the Elitism of Democrats, and the Need to Build a Hospitable Left. And it was a conversation that took place a couple of days after the election between Daniel Denvir, who hosts a podcast called The Dig, and his conversation with the one and only Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. And they talked about the 2024 presidential election results, this issue that they refer to as a multiracial working class dealignment with the Democratic Party. I'm sure we'll talk about that. The broader issues surrounding support for the Democratic Party in general, and ultimately their thoughts on where the left needs to go from here based off of the results and everything that took place. And so I thought this piece would be a great article and conversation for us to check out since, now we're officially in the new year. The inauguration is a couple of weeks away.
I guess so.
Right?
Yeah.
This thing is happening, whether we're ready for it or not. So I figured why not learn from the incredible Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who I think always offers and provides such brilliant analysis in her thinking and her work. And this was a phenomenal conversation between these two folks. So I'm excited for us to have a conversation about it and to kick off our podcast in the new year. So where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, what a conversation this is.
Yeah.
I am going to have to start listening to The Dig, apparently.
Yes.
I subscribed a while ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the subtitle is something about working class warfare or something.
Yes.
And that sounds like something I want to listen to.
Right.
And I haven't worked it into my routine.
Okay.
Podcast
Here we
listening
go.
that is fairly limited.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, I listen to hours and some other ones.
Right.
And there's not a lot of other time in the week.
Yeah.
But
this might make it happen.
I think
for you.
this was a great conversation.
Right.
They're doing stuff like this, and I also know that they're part of the Movement Media Alliance.
That's right.
And so I appreciate that. And I really appreciated the critiques of the Democratic Party here that you mentioned, the way they've lost connection with the working class.
Yeah.
And they talked a little bit about that through the way that the Democrats seem to court celebrities and wealthy donors.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes especially the wealthy donors are at odds with the needs of working class people.
That's right.
And I really appreciated the analysis from the beginning, too, about how the measures of the economic recovery that we use are out of step with people's lived experience.
Yes.
And so when Biden was campaigning on how well the economy was doing and is doing, that's not necessarily false.
Right.
But it feels incongruous with how people are actually experiencing the economy.
Yes.
And I think that created distrust in him. It created distrust in the Harris campaign when she took over.
Right.
And there's a lot of great analysis like that in this conversation that I think lines up with how I was sort of feeling throughout the campaign season and afterwards, really. Particularly, they talk about Gaza, they talk about the economic policies, obviously, the complete absence of progressive policies offered by the Harris campaign, removal of opposition to the death penalty, trotting out Liz Cheney as someone who's going to help win over voters for Harris.
What?
There's so much great analysis in this that points out a lot of the issues that really lead to alienating people, progressives, and people on the left, and alienating working class people simultaneously.
Yeah.
Which, if you're doing both of those things, is really hard to win
Absolutely.
in this country. And so, as a Democratic candidate, and the way that they lay this out in this conversation, it seems very clear that those are big factors in what happened.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me when I was deciding about which piece to bring, this was a very long conversation. It was a lengthy conversation,
Yeah.
but it was amazing. And part of it is, as you mentioned, they talk about so much. They talk about a lot of the failings of the Democratic Party and the campaigning and the decisions that were made. And you laid out some of those things. I think one of the most salient arguments or pieces of analysis that they talk about, and you mentioned this, are how people are tired, right? And are struggling in their everyday lives, especially economically. And that had a huge impact on folks' ability to sort of buy into the Democratic Party's rhetoric and messaging during the campaign and throughout the election. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because I thought this analysis was really poignant. So Keeanga says, quote, "The heart of Joe Biden's insistence that he remain in the race was that he had turned the economy around. By all conventional measures, the American economy was doing well. Unemployment historically low, poverty low for African Americans. The rate at which people are living in poverty is at historic lows. Biden was correct that the rate of inflation had precipitously declined. I think it's at around 2.1 now. The problem, falling rates of inflation are not falling prices.
Yeah.
It just means the rate at which prices are rising has slowed down. And so we are still stuck. Whether it's price gouging or not, the resting place of these prices is really out of whack with what people's incomes are, especially when you take into consideration the nest eggs that people had amassed through the COVID payments, whether it was enhanced unemployment, the stimulus checks, being at home and not having to pay for gas, rent moratorium. People were able to store away money, and that money's gone.
Yeah.
Savings over the summer began to dip as low as they had been in the recession of 2008. The Democratic Party seemed to have no consciousness of this. How does this economic picture play out in real life? A historic rise in homelessness is on schedule to rise even higher at the end of 2024. Food insecurity is high. All of these kinds of barometers by which people measure the quality of their life pointed downward for working class people. Median rent is 20% higher than it was in early 2020. There was a study that showed in the first quarter of 2024, household debt had exceeded $17 trillion. To the extent that people are holding their lives together, it's through credit cards, which of course we know is completely unsustainable. So that was a long quote, but there was so much in there. I wanted to pull the whole thing because it plays with you to think about all of these sort of economic measures that politicians and our government tout out as, these measures of success. But what they're getting to here is the lived experience, our lived experiences, and what it means to be in credit card debt, what it means to be living paycheck to paycheck, what it means to be food insecure. I mean, those are the real lived experiences of people, and that there's a disconnect then there for us with what the campaign is telling us and what our government is telling us. And with all of that, Keeanga goes on to talk about the failing of the Democratic Party's messaging around all of this and their unwillingness or inability to address it. And we now know what the impact of that was, right? And so all that to say, I think the point that they really hammer home here is that all of this is so critically important for the left to think about and to hopefully reimagine their strategy around not just how to talk to, but more importantly, I think how to improve the lives of working class people.
Yeah. And I think it's how to talk about, like, what are those economic measures actually doing for working class people?
Right.
And recognizing the disconnect, I think, is one of the first steps, that just because inflation isn't where it was. So yeah, all of that's really important. And then one of the things that stood out to me is that Daniel said, quote, "I think and worry that if we see a new wave of serious repression of the left, unlike anything we've seen in my lifetime under Trump, we will look back at these liberal elected officials and administrators as having set important precedents and having legitimated it."
Wow.
And so in this moment, he's talking about the repression of protesters for a ceasefire in Palestine and the repression of Stop Cop City protesters in Atlanta. And these are warning signs that Democratic Party leadership in cities across the country or on the so-called woke campuses across the country already have an appetite for authoritarian behavior when it suits them, when it's beneficial to them, and their ability to control narratives or to control populations or whatever. And I think Daniel's point here is really important, because how are they legitimizing the kinds of things that Trump is threatening to do to a whole lot of people who disagree with him?
Right.
How does charging people with racketeering for organizing petitions in Atlanta create pathways for someone like Donald Trump to call these people enemies of the state?
Wow.
And then use the functions of the state, the arms of the state, the law enforcement of the state to say, hey, these are enemies of the state, and lock them up? How does labeling an encampment as anti-Semitic and then sending in the cops to arrest everyone lead to Donald Trump deciding that something is illegal or immoral and using the military or the FBI or whatever as his own police force?
Oh, that's scary.
We've already seen him do that in 2020. He cleared out that block and then went and had his little photo op with a Bible in front of that church.
Yes.
And so we already have a precedent for understanding how he uses federal law enforcement for things like a photo op. And what does it look like to be further emboldened by some of the things that people who are so-called liberals doing in the wake of protests or in the wake of uprisings against a cop city? How is all of this emboldening him, really?
Yeah, that's really scary to think about. Like, if these things are already happening, him stepping into office with this precedent, as you say. Man, there's a lot to think about there.
And precedents around the country.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
All kinds of local precedent.
Absolutely. And then you're right. What does that mean for him sitting in federal office? Yeah, absolutely. Using that power. Wow. So there's a lot of great stuff there. One of the other things I appreciated in this conversation was their discussion around racism in this country. Right. And the role that played in the election. And again, this notion of where the left is losing people. And Keeanga, as always, offered some brilliant analysis around this. So this is another kind of long quote. She said, quote, "Black Lives Matter was so important in terms of raising the profile of the impact of racism in the lives of Black people in this country in ways that are hard to appreciate now because it's become such an accepted and understood aspect of life for Black people in the United States. 10 years or 15 years earlier, there's really an absence of discussion about the impacts of racism in the lives of Black people. One of the other things that the best parts of the Black Lives Matter movement did was demonstrate how the working class character of Black life is part of what make Black people vulnerable to policing and to the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal legal system. The problem, though, is that a movement focused purely or exclusively on the lives of Black people actually doesn't have the social capacity to transform those conditions that make Black people vulnerable to policing in the first place." So that's great, right? And so then a little bit later on, she goes on to say, "We saw in 2020, one of the reasons why the backlash was triggered was because of the radicalization of young white people. Because millions of white people were marching against racism, sometimes in places where there were no Black people. And we have a left that often responds so cynically to that. Like, oh, do you want a cookie for fighting racism? No, people don't want cookies for fighting racism. This is an important development in our political movement to try to build the type of mass movement that's necessary to change the social and political conditions that are disproportionately affecting Black people, but that are affecting the entire working class and poor people in this country. That's the kind of vehicle we need to organize and to build." And I think what's key there in what Keeanga said is not only is this a call to action for all of us, right? We have to collectively organize and build this movement for our collective liberation, for sure. But it's also a call to action to the left as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a key part of their conversation is that they talk a lot, it's in the title, about the hospitality of the left, how the left needs to be more hospitable to more folks. And there's some really good quotes about that throughout the article that I don't have at my fingertips right now, but I think they're really important. And I think one of the connections that they make, that Keeanga in particular makes, between organizers and activists and policy decisions, and how that was lost in this cycle.
That's right. Yep.
So she talks about how in 2020 there was a big connection between what organizers wanted to see and what the Democratic Party said, oh, okay, people are out in the streets. People want to see this.
Yes.
Let's do some aligning here. And we lost that in this cycle. So she says, quote, we can go through the Democratic Party platform that was turned over to activists to basically rewrite in the summer of 2020. The promises to cancel student debt, to pay for family leave, to invest money in childcare, on and on and on. And what happened? And, so much of the narrative around the 2020 election, looking back, was who could beat Trump.
Yes.
And from my perspective anyway, the narrative coming out of the Democratic Party nationally and from the candidate himself was that Joe Biden was the only one who could beat him.
Only one.
And maybe there was something to that because he did win that election. So, props to him, I guess. There is that piece. But I think that this quote is really what it is.
Yes.
It's not about what individual can beat Trump, but how can someone organize and energize people to turn out to beat Trump?
You're right. Yes.
It wasn't just about Joe Biden. A whole lot of us voted for Joe Biden despite a lot of concerns about Joe Biden because of what the uprisings in 2020 made him promise, a lot of which Keeanga names in this quote.
Right.
These were real policy ideas. They were not abstract.
Yes.
Saying paid family leave, cancel student debt, money investment in childcare. People understand that.
Absolutely. People want that. People need that.
Want that. They need that. And they understand at the end of the day, cancel student debt. That means that my monthly expenses go down X $100.
Absolutely.
Whatever that is. Yeah. And that's an immediate impact. I understand what that means to my life.
Yes.
And none of that happened this go around. And we were also, at the time, 2020, we were living through a time where we saw government change overnight.
Literally overnight. Yeah.
We saw rent control happen in some way by putting a moratorium on evictions.
Right.
We can cancel student debt because debt payments were paused and everything kept working.
The world kept spinning, yes.
So combine that the lived realities that we were living in were changed overnight with so much of the ways that people were tired and done with Trump and his nonsense and the way that he mismanaged the pandemic early on and so much upheaval with COVID and uprisings and more. But I think the driving, motivating factor here was that Biden and the DNC platform were materially beneficial for regular people. And it was easy to see how. It was easy to understand. And that's what they ran on, and that's what they won on.
Right.
And this time we just let all that go.
Let all that go. And it's really hard to fathom that there weren't strategists and folks sort of saying to Democratic leadership we had this playbook and it worked, and we look at what happened during the COVID pandemic, and let's not do that. Let's not capitalize on that. Yeah, it is so fascinating to see all of the ways in which the Democratic Party did not show up for real people, for working class people. Yeah, this go around. Absolutely. All right, well, this feels like a great place to shift our conversation over to the application segment of our show. This is where in case you've forgotten, this is where we talk about how this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work.
Thank you for the refresher.
There you go. I knew you needed it.
It's been a couple weeks.
My application comes from a part of Daniel and Keeanga's discussion around what the left is going to need to do in terms of uniting people and developing a plan for tackling the issues that affect people's everyday lives. So Daniel says, quote, I think something that we always point to and that you're rightfully pointing to here is that we don't have a majority support on so many of our core issues. Mm-hmm. But what we have failed to do so far is to create a bigger story, a bigger narrative, a new form of common sense, something that makes all of this compelling as a cohesive form of politics that people will identify with.
Yeah.
If we could run all of our left platform as referenda simultaneously through the nation, we'd have social democracy, if not socialism, overnight. But that's not how it works. We need to construct some sort of cohesive political package that appeals to a majority, and that's what we haven't figured out. Mm-hmm. And then in response, Keeanga said, that's the big vacuum. It can be described as the distance between what people want and the vehicle by which we can achieve that. The Democratic Party has always posited itself as that since at least the last 3/4 of the 20th century. But I think in some ways, the end of Obama's presidency marked a finality in a certain kind of belief in liberalism. This failed campaign of Kamala Harris's really closes the coffin on that. So this is a structural problem for the Democratic Party. How will they reconstitute an electoral coalition that can give them an ability to compete in these races?
Yeah.
And I think that's such a hugely important question, you know, and the Democratic Party has to address it, has to figure it out. And they need to do so in ways that center the everyday lived experiences of people and what they need and what they're asking for and what they need to thrive. And as you said, like what activists are doing, what people are organizing around, what people are fighting for in local communities and sort of even on a grander scale than that. The Democratic Party has to be attuned to that, it has to tap into that and has to work for it.
Yeah. I think that it's obvious that they haven't done that in so many ways. I think even looking at 16, 20, 24, what are there are some other themes there that maybe need some unpacking.
Right.
But also, what are your platforms?
Yes.
If you look at your platforms, how are your platforms popular? How are they not popular in 16, 20, 24? Those are the last three most important elections of our lifetime, so to speak.
Right.
And if we determine that policy is what people want to see ideas that they know will make their lives better.
Right.
Where do you see those play out in very concrete ways? And that's not to say that that wasn't real in 16 and or to some extent this year, but where was it most clear for people?
Yeah.
And I think that that's one way to find an answer to how to build that coalition again.
Absolutely.
My application comes from something that Keeanga said, and to introduce this a little bit, they're talking about Bernie Sanders' campaign in 16 and in 20, and the way that he talked about issues and how that could be something to get back to as well, as we recognize the realities of working class people in this country. So she says, quote, "We could talk about the economic categories or statistics, the study about the deaths of working class white people that came out right before the pandemic, the so-called deaths of despair, in which ordinary white working class people without college degrees were dying of drug addiction, opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. What has happened through the pandemic to now, the rate at which white people were dying quicker, black working class people have caught up. And so the mutual immiseration of the lives of the multiracial working class absolutely lays the political foundation for a movement. The problem is not that the potential doesn't exist. It's that it has not been a part of any real political initiative in the U.S. And I think this is one of the most important parts of the article.
Yes.
We have a foundation for a movement. We know what life is like for working class people in this country. We know that the extractive neoliberal economic policies of the last 40 to 50 years in this country have all been laid on the backs of the working class people, of regular people.
Yes.
And groups like the Working Families Party and a variety of other organizations who are in coalition with them are starting to address this, and they're starting to build some of these coalitions.
Right.
But ultimately, this kind of leadership is scary to the mainstream parties because it means big changes for how stuff works in electoral politics.
Yes.
This is why national Democratic leadership shut down Bernie in 16 and in 20 and some other progressive campaigns too along the way.
That's right.
And why they primaried some progressive candidates out of their seats this year. But this is what we need. We need a big working class coalition of people who will shift economic and political power to regular people,
right,
and away from billionaires and wealthy donor class folks and those people who are really at odds with what it is that we need in this country.
Absolutely. Well, this is so much of why we talk about collective liberation, right? And when we talk about, that quote in there talks about white working class people and black working class people have caught up. I mean, the ways in which lived experiences are so similar and the battles folks are fighting are so similar. And so organizations, as you say, like the Working Families Party have studied this, are in it, are, in the trenches, listening to people, figuring out what it's going to take to make their lives better. And it's up to our elected officials to listen to that, to hear that, to understand that, and to develop policies and laws and an economy that works for people.
Right.
That absolutely is an incredible application from this conversation. So I'm glad you brought that. Absolutely. All right, well, let's shift now to the homework portion of our show. I know you haven't forgot, but this is where we talk about how we're going to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave this table that we're sitting at and our conversation about this piece. So one thing I'd like to do for homework, you mentioned this too, I want to check out this podcast, Daniel Denvir's podcast, which again is called The Dig. I really appreciated so much of what he had to say in this conversation with Keeanga.
Yep.
Obviously, I know her work and her brilliance, and I'm always gravitating towards that. But this is my first introduction to Daniel, and so I'd love to see what more I could learn from him and his work and what he's putting out on his podcast. I also dug a little did a little research on him. He released a book in 2020 called All American Nativism, How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It, which just sounded like a really fascinating book and title. And it's all about the various forces of all American nativism over the past 40 or 50 years that have been pushing politics to the right. And it helped explain how we got to the place we are in terms of our immigration politics, but also just in general. And so I think I'm going to add that book to our long list of books to read because it sounds fascinating. What about,
it does.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, my homework is to check out more episodes from The Dig.
Okay. I like it.
That's all my homework.
Yeah. You already got it queued up, so you just got to push play.
It's already in the feed.
It's already in the
feed. Just got to hit one.
I love it. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our very first episode of 2025.
Woo!
I know. I'm so excited to be back, my friend. You're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am bringing a documentary called Demon Mineral.
Okay.
Which is about uranium mining in the lands of the Diné Navajo people.
Okay.
And what that mining has done to people and the land there and the work that the Diné have done in response to this mining.
Okay.
It's on Canopy, and so this is a little piece of the description of the documentary from there. Quote, in the span of just 4 generations, entire ways of living have been lost or severely compromised as mining has contaminated the air, water, livestock, and land upon which the community relies for its existence. The film also celebrates the actions the Diné community is taking to fight against new mines and improve life in an irradiated ecosystem, which has resulted in the sharp rise in cancer, kidney failure, and other diseases.
Wow.
Yeah, so it looks like a very powerful film, which I'm sure that we're going to learn a lot from.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've not heard of this documentary, so I'm super excited about it. And, I think we've consumed some media before around this idea of, environmental justice. And there's so much it sounds like that's wrapped up in this as well. So I'm excited to check this one out. Another Canopy documentary. That's really exciting. Very good. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that. But with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok, check us out on YouTube, and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.